If you stopped me on the street on any given day and asked what my favorite video game of all time is, I'd be hard-pressed to give you a definitive answer. One day, I might tell you it's Halo Combat Evolved, which hooked me on its lore and storytelling for the better part of a decade and ignited a passion for competitive first-person shooters that still burns in me to this day. Another time, I might tell you it's Age of Empires 2, which not only made me a sucker for good RTS games, but a passionate lover of history as well. Depending on my mood, I might tell you my favorite game is The Witcher 3 or Mass Effect 3, the only two games I've played in my entire life with the emotional depth capable of bringing me to tears at their endings. You could receive a plethora of answers. How can anyone choose one game above all others, really? But in any given instance, there's quite a high chance I'd tell you my favorite game of all time is The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. While I had played Morrowind before it, Oblivion and its graphical advances, gameplay systems, and the setting of Cyrodiil all combined into a perfect storm that swept me away from the very first time I fought my way out of the Imperial sewers, and has never let me escape its influence in all the years since. Maybe it was the beauty of the Imperial heartland, or the mysteries of its ancient alien inhabitants that struck me. Or perhaps it was the epic scale of its main story, and the depth of the characters I met during my fight against Mehrunes Dagon. Maybe still it was the enthralling faction quest lines or the game's two excellent expansion packs. Regardless of the true force behind it, if there's a Bethesda Game Studios RPG in existence, from New Vegas to Skyrim to everything else in between, it's a part of my gaming history, and I wouldn't love video games half as much as I do without their influence. So, as the hopeless Todd Howard stan that I am, from the very first moment Starfield was revealed back in June 2018, I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. As soon as the image of a space station graced my eyeballs, with the knowledge BGS was behind it, I was sold. As a huge fan of the Mass Effect series, my mind promptly exploded at the idea of a Bethesda RPG set amongst the stars in the same vein as Commander Shepard's iconic journey. After 5 long years of waiting, after delays and the never-ending question of, can Bethesda really pull this off? The game was released on September 6, 2023, and after racking up a player count above 10 million, it's hard to argue Starfield wasn't the commercial success Bethesda and Microsoft were hoping for. But for lifelong BGS fans like myself, was Starfield the game we had hoped for? Was it the game I had dreamt of? A sprawling space adventure that would take the Bethesda RPG formula to the next level? Well, after 60-some hours with Starfield, I can confidently say the answer to that question is yes. And no. Let me explain. Yes, Starfield is, in many ways, exactly what I had hoped it would be. A well-constructed sci-fi universe, full of rich lore, warring factions, and multifaceted characters with their own struggles, triumphs, and heartbreaks they'll share with you, if you let them. The game delivers on so many of the things it promised. Graphics improvements, spaceflight and combat, complex customization systems, and quest lines both large and small that sink their teeth into you and don't let go until they reach their often epic conclusions. On the other hand, Starfield is a clearly flawed product, which many players, both fans and haters alike, expected from BGS. The bugs that Bethesda is known for are back in full force, and not all of them are the funny, laugh-it-off kind we've grown to love over the years. The game is saddled with many new and often confusing systems that are poorly explained, and suffers from severe pacing issues, dragging out its first several hours into a painful slog that many players will bounce off of, never to return. My time spent with Starfield was very much like a roller coaster. It began with a sharp downward trend, kicked off by an excruciatingly long intro, punctuated by the occasional uplifting moment where I could clearly see greatness peeking through the cracks, unable to break through quite yet. Things got so bad about halfway through my playthrough that with Cyberpunk 2077's Phantom Liberty expansion right around the corner, I contemplated dropping the game entirely and kicking off my return to Night City a bit early. Then, just as my patience was running out, I changed one single thing about how I approached the game, and suddenly, I was experiencing what so many people had in the weeks since its release. Pure bliss. In the blink of an eye, my Starfield roller coaster changed from a steep downhill descent to a rocket-fast climb back into the stars above. And, another 30 hours later as I rolled the game's credits, I sat back in my chair and breathed a sigh of relief, incredibly thankful that I stuck with the game after all. As it turned out, my highly anticipated return to Night City could wait just a little longer. My experience with Starfield was anything but ordinary, and for that reason, my discussion of the game will follow in those footsteps. Instead of my typical review structure, I'll be breaking Starfield down into 3 categories: the good, the bad, and the not for me. The good and the bad should be pretty self-explanatory. These are the things I liked about the game, or those I didn't. The final category is a little different, and we'll get to that when the time comes. If you're still with me at this point, you're probably wondering where the hell I'm going with all of this. So sit back, relax, and let's get into the review, shall we? When it comes to things Starfield does right, there are certainly plenty. I'll begin with some of the more technical aspects: settings, graphics, and an impressive attention to detail. The game settings menu offers a fairly standard slate of options for players to tweak, from graphics and audio to accessibility and key bindings. While the range of options is pretty standard, the descriptors for each setting and the breakdown of how they'll affect the look of your game and its performance are a bit lacking. Still, everything the average player needs is there, and you can mess around until you find that sweet spot between smooth function and shiny looks. Graphic fidelity is perhaps one of the areas where Bethesda has made the biggest leaps and bounds with what their Creation Engine 2 can provide, and it is readily apparent from the very first moment you enter the game. Character models and environmental details are leaps and bounds ahead of games like Fallout 76 and Skyrim, and despite criticisms of their engine, many of which are valid, BGS has clearly pushed the bounds of what it can do with undeniable results. While Starfield's visual quality is easily a step, or two, or three above previous Bethesda titles, there are two areas where things break down a bit. Despite a very nice coat of fresh paint, Starfield's characters are still very clearly Bethesda NPCs, and fans of the studio will know exactly what I mean by that. This Bethesda-ness becomes especially apparent when highlighted in certain lighting, making them look quite ghastly, dare I say ghoulish. Facial expressions can also seem stiff at times, but the vast majority of animations are wildly improved. Paired with the game's improved aesthetic is the painstaking detail Bethesda is known for when breathing life into their worlds. From the whoosh of cycling airlocks on a barren moon, to spaceship docking tubes linking up for a boarding action, or different characters displaying unique patches on their individual spacesuits, the game spares no expense in making you feel right at home in the endless bounds of space. There is also a similar focus on detail behind the scenes. Perk icons will change as they improve, along with your level indicator, which will grow more complex and intricate as your overall power increases. These functions are not only easily noticeable, but genuinely add to your immersion at every turn. Before diving into Starfield, you'll need to create your player character, and this is another area that was quite impressive. There are tons of visual options to choose from hairstyles to skin tones to scars, or anything else you can imagine. The level of fine-tuning available for each facial feature's look and placement was equally impressive, and it's easy to see how players can get lost in this menu for hours, even as someone who only spends a fraction of that time tweaking my looks before jumping into the action. Along with tuning your physical appearance, part of creating each character is selecting their background and traits. Similar to choosing a race or class in the Elder Scrolls, your background gives you a slight boost to several predetermined skills. As a soldier, the background I chose, you receive a bump to your fitness, ballistics, and boost pack training skills, which gives you a slight edge in those areas of combat. However, each background really amounts to a small head start in certain areas of the game, so if you choose one and have second thoughts about it later, don't feel like you need to go back and start a whole new character. Finally, in addition to your looks and background, you can choose up to 3 entirely optional traits. These are small, but sometimes quite meaningful tweaks to your experience. You may own a house and be saddled with the corresponding mortgage payment, gain bonuses or penalties depending on whether you travel alone or with a friend, and might even be visited by a character seemingly from another universe who's quite a fan of your work. While they add a bit of flavor to each playthrough, traits are by no means required and can even be removed later down the line through various means. While the character you create forms the base of your playstyle, the real meat comes into play with skills, each of which provides certain bonuses or unlocks new gameplay features. These are generally quite good, allowing you to further tailor your playstyle and improve in specific areas. To advance a skill, you must perform specific actions associated with it. If you want to improve your ship piloting and gain access to better craft, you must defeat enemy spaceships. Advancing skills through associated actions feels thematic, but there are a few pitfalls to the system. Stealth builds can take quite a bit of investment before becoming viable, and actions performed prior to a skill being leveled up don't count towards its next stage. If I've shot down 50 ships and need to shoot down 5 to level up my piloting skill, I should be able to progress it immediately the next time I have an available skill point to use. While many skills meaningfully impact your playstyle, others seem largely pointless. In Starfield, you may encounter environmental hazards while exploring, which will reduce your overall health pool during extended contact, synonymous with radiation from Fallout. There is a skill that provides more resistance to those hazards, and while that might sound useful, in practice they are either easily avoidable or their effects are negligible, to the point where that skill will never be needed. Why not roll it into another related skill as a passive bonus when reaching its mastery, instead of potentially causing players to waste skill points on it? While this can be annoying, the majority of skills and perks are unaffected, and collectible skill boosting magazines also make a return, so you can improve aspects of your character without sacrificing a skill point to do so, if you have a keen eye for collectibles while out exploring. Speaking of gameplay, a core component in any Bethesda title is its combat, and Starfield's frenetic encounters are some of the best we've seen from BGS. When they said there was a focus on improving combat, they weren't kidding. Gunplay feels quite good overall, and the combination of shooting your weapon and outmaneuvering enemies, often in 0G, which adds quite a bit of verticality to many of your encounters, forms an immensely satisfying package that only got better as the game progressed. So much so that after using them a couple times during my first few hours, I dropped melee weapons entirely for the remainder of my playthrough. There is a huge variety of weapons to choose from, both in the way each gun functions and how they look. And man, did they look really cool. Whether you're spraying enemies down with a hail of bullets, melting them with lasers, showering them with energy waves, or blowing them to pieces with heavy ordnance, there are a plethora of tools at your disposal in the combat sandbox, encouraging varied playstyles and allowing you a large amount of freedom in how you approach each run-in with your enemies. Some of which can be quite dumb, unfortunately. While shooting your guns does feel great, there are a couple minor pain points to account for. Weapon bloom, especially in the game's early stages before gaining access to more combat-focused perks, can be atrocious, particularly when firing in low gravity. There are also interesting weapon modifiers to try out, like bonus damage against specific enemy types or different ammo selections, but others are wildly ineffective. Reduced damage output during ground operations while gaining more DPS in space will never make a meaningful difference during combat, and you're much better off finding another weapon with better stats. Your gear has similar modifiers, and these are a mixed bag as well. Some can be quite powerful and hilarious when timed right, like disarming, staggering, and igniting nearby enemies, while others like automatically using a med pack when your health gets low, although useful in the rare case you forget to watch your health bar, will often be overshadowed by clearly superior options. In addition to modifiers you find in the wild, you can also customize your equipment at workbenches, allowing you to further augment your guns with scopes, suppressors, and other attachments, each of which comes with its own bonuses and trade-offs. Fallout veterans will be quite familiar with this system by now, and its inclusion here is another nice way to help make each loadout truly your own. Along with your weapons, gear, and throwables like grenades and mines, you'll also gain access to space magic partway through the main quest. And while not all of these otherworldly powers improve your combat prowess, many do, and can give you a serious edge in battle when deployed correctly. Actions like lifting enemies into the air and immobilizing them, knocking them to the ground, and disarming them entirely are often reminiscent of Skyrim's unlockable shouts, and provide the same bump in power that can turn seemingly unfavorable combat encounters into easily conquered cakewalks. And they're generally a blast to use. Pun intended. Beyond ground pounding across unexplored planets and exchanging gunshots with the ne'er-do-wells of the settled systems, you spend quite a bit of time in your spaceship, or ships, depending on how many you eventually collect. The time I spent flying my ship, shooting down other vessels, and doing anything at all involving my spacecraft was where Starfield truly shined, and quickly cemented itself as one of my absolute favorite parts of the game. Yes, flying around in your spaceship really is as cool as everyone says. Beyond that, the design of Starfield spacecraft, your ship-to-ship combat encounters, and vessel customization are all top-notch, albeit with some inconveniences to tussle with here and there. Quite early on in the main quest, you'll gain access to your first ship, the Frontier, a fairly basic A-class vessel that serves as your introduction into Starfield spaceship systems. I saw a lot of complaints about how the Frontier is a piece of crap compared to many of the other ships you can build, steal, or obtain through various means. And while that isn't untrue, there are much better ships out there, I also wasn't bothered by it nearly as much as some others were. In fact, I held on to and used the Frontier for almost 95% of my playthrough, throwing in upgrades and improvements here and there when I felt they were needed. Ship combat is also quite enjoyable, and only gets better as you acquire improved vessels. Early on, you can begin the UC Vanguard quest chain, which involves a piloting exam to cement your entrance into the organization. During this flight test, you'll gain access to a simulated ship that's a big step up from what the Frontier is capable of. And for those who aren't gelling with the starter vessel's combat prowess, this is an excellent taste of how much better it can feel when you find yourself at the helm of a beefed up ship. In addition to a plethora of preset variants you'll encounter, players also have the ability to build their own starships from scratch, and anyone plugged into the Starfield discourse has no doubt seen some absolutely wild configurations, ranging from a cube-shaped model that enemy AI found impossible to hit, recreations of iconic vessels like Halo's Pelican and Star Wars' X-Wing, and even flying hamburgers and other wacky designs that are true testaments to what you can come up with if you're dedicated enough. Although this was one of Starfield's components I enjoyed the most, it wasn't without its flaws either. Many of the concepts involved with piloting and maintaining your ships are poorly explained. For instance, I had no idea individual ship systems like your engine and grav drive would repair themselves over time after being disabled. Either I completely missed that explanation early on, or the game once again failed to clarify it clearly. The fuel consumption mechanic is also almost entirely pointless. While it makes sense in theory, ships with lower reserves of fuel and smaller grav drives cannot go as far as their larger counterparts, in practice what it really means is instead of selecting a faraway destination and clicking a button once to jump there, you're forced to bunny hop your way across multiple systems, achieving the exact same outcome, only with more loading screens and annoyance along the way. This also ties into another criticism of the game. It's less than seamless space travel. In something like No Man's Sky or Star Citizen, you can literally pilot your ship from world to world, traveling vast distances without any sort of in-game interruption. In Starfield, however, almost all of your space travel will be done via loading screens, and you can also simply fast travel from one grounded location to another, making the process of skipping between worlds much more streamlined, and the irrelevance of fuel consumption even more evident. Starfield drew quite a bit of criticism for this implementation, but I gotta be honest, I don't think it's that big of a deal. At the end of the day, it's still a Bethesda RPG, and fast travel has always been a core component of their games. Is it disappointing for those hoping for a more interactive experience like No Man's Sky or Elite Dangerous? Sure, and I get that, but it's far from a deal breaker. You'll do most of this interstellar fast traveling from the star map, which can be accessed from your ship's interior or in-game menu. It's nothing to write home about, and could be a bit wonky in terms of zooming and scrolling, at least on controller, but it worked and that's what matters. And watching your ship lift off and rocket into the star-filled sky never got old, even 60 plus hours in. Despite some complaints about the manner in which you traverse Starfield's universe, Bethesda has once again done a stellar job of crafting an intriguing setting, filled with the kind of intricate lore and world building, beautiful and exotic locations, plus deeply engaging quests and complex characters they're known for. The Elder Scrolls and Fallout have decades of lore to pull from when creating their game worlds, but Starfield is a brand new IP, and while there isn't the same built-up history you see in those other titles, BGS has done a great job of crafting yet another series that will have lore masters pumping out content for quite some time. You're immediately swept up in a flood of information about the settled systems in which Starfield takes place. Factions, governments, and criminal organizations all vying for power, and plenty of varied locations across which these struggles take place. Your interest only deepens as you visit each new planet, and further immerse yourself in the storied history of the factions that dwell there. The background of Starfield's universe contains plenty of interesting hooks to catch your attention and keep you invested. Stories of horrific xeno-warfare experiments gone wrong, the terrifying mechs that were used to wage brutal war and subsequently banned by all parties involved, and a mysterious cult of serpent-worshipping fanatics that disappeared into the stars, reappeared to launch a bloody crusade, and then vanished once again, just to name a few. The game even includes a history museum on New Atlantis, that you can visit at your own leisure and are optionally pushed through during the Vanguard questline. I highly recommend visiting it at some point, because it provides a great breakdown of the game's timeline, if somewhat skewed by the UC's viewpoint. Speaking of the UC, each of the game's major factions are distinct in their ideologies, styles, governments, and ways of life. The United Colonies are all about law and order, even at the cost of bureaucratic red tape and gross governmental oversight, and are often seen as the most civilized of these entities, if not the most efficient. Standing in stark contrast to that worldview is the Freestar Collective, a hodgepodge of independent-minded planets that banded together to form a joint opposition to the UC. Freedom is their watchword, which is great for some of their citizens and allows for the existence of worlds such as Neon, a cyberpunk pleasure city based around legal use of the drug Aurora, but also results in rampant poverty without the societal backstops provided by the UC. And having a city constructed entirely around the production and consumption of a supposedly regulated drug has its downfalls, as you can imagine. Then there's House Varun, the mysterious fanatics that have long plagued both the UC and Freestar Collective with their seemingly random incursions and mysterious departures from organized society. And, while you'll get glimpses into their culture and even get to know some of their people, it seems Bethesda might be saving their full story for another day. At some point, you'll also find yourself tangled up with the Crimson Fleet, a massive gang of ne'er-do-wells, cutthroats, and all-around less-than-upstanding citizens who have carved out their own existence in the settled systems. And I mean that quite literally. Whether you choose to join them in their bloody ventures or seek to dismantle the organization once and for all, you'll eventually find yourself caught in their web of crime one way or another. Starfield's largest omission in terms of faction content is the lack of any smuggling-related storyline. Where's the Thieves Guild in Space quest that has you smuggling cargo and meeting shady characters in backwater bars, Han Solo style? With the inclusion of contraband and shielded cargo specifically for the purpose of hiding it, the tools are there but the questline is not. As someone who doesn't usually get invested in these types of storylines, even my interest would have been piqued had something like this been included. Despite its absence, the scope of Starfield's other faction quests certainly provide enough content to sink your teeth into. The factions of Starfield are all intriguing, and the planets, or space stations they inhabit, have been brought to life in equally good measure. Whether you find yourself walking amongst the airy beauty of New Atlantis, or the rustic sights in Aquila City, drudging through the red-stained mining halls of Sidonia and the dark crevasses of the Key, or enjoying yourself, maybe a little too much, under the shining lights of neon, each of the game's major locations offer a stunningly unique aesthetic. As I strutted along the dusty roads of Aquila City for the first time, I felt transported straight from Starfield into Fallout New Vegas, and was hit by the same sense of wonder and awe I felt when stepping into the Mojave Desert for the very first time. And, while the Astral Lounge in Neon does its best to provide a dance floor atmosphere akin to the Citadel from Mass Effect, it unfortunately doesn't hold a candle to Commander Shepard's exquisite dance parties. Cities in Starfield are massive, and this is immediately apparent each time you enter one for the first time. You're greeted by crowds of NPCs. And when I say crowds, I mean it. The density of characters on screen far outpaces anything else we've seen from Bethesda in the past. This scale continues in the zones outside these cities, which is where I found Starfield's best open-world exploration experiences waiting for me. Wandering around these areas, full of map markers to chase and locations to explore, felt like wandering through one of Skyrim's holds for the very first time, and were the only instances I truly felt the unrivaled magic of exploring an open world crafted by Bethesda. Something we'll circle back around to towards the end of this review. The game's locations also feature another hallmark of BGS design, plenty of random encounters, hidden secrets, and environmental storytelling to discover, both on the surface of Starfield's worlds and amongst its stars. When you jump into a new system for the first time, you'll often encounter an unknown ship or space station, many of which are hostile and can be blown to bits on sight, while others will ask for your help or just chat you up, offering nice and often funny bits of conversation here and there throughout your journey. Some of my favorite random run-ins took place in the dark void of space, but there were also plenty to uncover on the planets below. Whether it's running into a bounty hunter chasing down his target on an unexplored moon, discovering an abandoned research vessel overrun by alien spores, or meeting Space Grandma, who made sure I was nice and fed before sending me on my way, these random blips help to break up the monotony of exploration and offer some truly memorable encounters. These locations are also packed with cool little secrets to find. A nice gear upgrade in a hidden container or behind a locked door here, a smattering of lore that contributes to the game's world building there. Interesting locations are great and all, but what would any Bethesda RPG truly be without a strong cast of characters and interesting quests to complete? Thankfully, the game delivers on these fronts as well, and they are perhaps the very best of what Starfield has to offer. Each of the four main companions, Sarah, Andreja, Sam, and Barrett, are fantastic. They are all complex people with varying emotions, outlooks on life in the settled systems, and toolsets with which they assist you during your journey. Even the minor Constellation characters, especially my homie Vasco, are interesting and get their own moments to shine during the main quest, whether by briefly accompanying you on one of your interstellar jaunts, or helping out back at the lodge. By the end of my playthrough, I had grown quite fond of them all. Looking back after rolling credits, I was quite surprised at how much my feelings towards these individuals had changed. At the start of my adventure, I found several of them to be bland and uninteresting, cookie-cutter characters that added little of interest or value to the world around them. I couldn't have been more wrong on that account, and as they opened up and I got to know them better, I discovered layers of depth hiding just below the surface. Whether it was Sarah opening up about her dark past, Barrett dropping his funny guy facade, sort of, Andreja hitting you with a thrilling twist that I never saw coming, or Sam and his daughter Cora's heartwarming banter while flying through the stars, each cemented a special place in my heart during the time I spent adventuring with them. I chose to romance Sarah in my first playthrough, and overall, the end result felt good. Nothing comparable to something like Cyberpunk or Mass Effect, but still heartwarming nonetheless. I'm not advocating for Starfield to have graphic sex scenes patched in down the line, but a little more maturity in the tone of your relationships couldn't hurt. There's a lot of high school level, I love you, no, I love you energy in some of the dialogue, and it could have benefited from a slightly more mature tone in some instances. Still solid overall though, and I was never left feeling unhappy with my choice. A huge improvement to companions in Starfield is their ability to actually follow you in a way that doesn't make you want to scream at them, pull your hair out, or put a fist through your monitor. They're even quite adept at engaging in stealth and using their own boost packs to navigate the game's often highly vertical environments. Their walking and running speeds do leave a lot to be desired though. Why they can't just keep pace with you is a mystery I will never understand. When it comes to mission design, there is an incredible variety on offer, and several of Starfield's quests across the main, side, and faction varieties were some of the best I've played in any Bethesda game to date. The main quest takes a while to really heat up, but once it gets going, it really gets going, and doesn't let up until the climactic ending. By the time I was fully invested, I could barely tear myself away to explore any other content. While a chunk of the main story arc is made up of repetitive fetch quests, several of its missions were truly unique, including a Titanfall 2-esque adventure that saw you hopping between multiverses, and was one of my absolute favorites. The faction quests are also top-notch across the board, providing fun and interesting plot lines to follow and encouraging various playstyles and approaches to completing their objectives. You'll have the opportunity to serve both the United Colonies and Freestar Collective in their own ways, along with performing dubious corporate espionage for Ryujin Industries and potentially pirating your way across the settled systems as a member of the Crimson Fleet. Each faction is filled with fun stories, cool characters, and plenty of action to keep you on your toes. Starfield's huge array of side quests and minor missions also impressed. Some of my favorites were the Terramorph questline, which had me feeling like I was trapped in the middle of an Alien movie, being chased by one of Fallout's Deathclaws pumped up on steroids, and your funny yet deeply profound encounter with Juno, which, for those who haven't done that quest yet, I won't spoil anymore. More kudos go out to the game's audio. Music, combat, voice acting, the whole 9 yards. Bethesda has never failed to create banger soundtracks, and Starfield continues that impressive track record. An enthralling OST, which often reminded me of Mass Effect's music, particularly that of ME1, felt right at home in its setting, and often elevated what would otherwise be mundane moments, like walking from one point in Neon to another. Combat and enemy sound design are also impressive, but I need to give a special shout out to the game's voice actors, all of whom delivered excellent performances. Cissy Jones, Barry Wiggins, Elias Tufexis, and Emily O'Brien all nailed their roles as your closest confidants and brought their respective characters to life perfectly.
Look, I haven't got a single credit to spare right now, okay? You can't squeeze blood from a stone. You know? Right?
Clearly this man has never seen how hard I can squeeze.
My final topic in the good section is the main quest ending and how Starfield handles New Game Plus. And this segment will contain serious story spoilers. If you haven't finished the main story yet and don't want it to be ruined for you, now's your chance to skip ahead to the next section. Okay, ready? Here we go. For me, the main quest really found its footing a little over halfway through, when you first encounter the Starborn. Their reveal was cool, kicking up the story's tension and further adding to the mystery of the artifacts, while also offering a high-level challenge when encountering them as enemies. The Hunter and Emissary were both intriguing, and the moment they unmasked themselves had me sitting back in my chair and asking myself, what the f*** is happening? Their diametrically opposed viewpoints, while somewhat boring, provided a solid context for the game's ultimate question. Which is better? A dog-eat-dog world where the strongest determine its ultimate outcome, or one where people must be saved from themselves before given the chance to decide their own fate? The sequence where you and your Constellation comrades escape from the Hunter's attack on New Atlantis, and your subsequent return to the now burned out city was gripping, and once again reminded me of the Reaper-infested Citadel from Mass Effect 3. Your assault to obtain the final artifact is a tense, epic, and enjoyable combat sequence, culminating in one final showdown with the Hunter and Emissary. Despite my annoyance with the two, I chose to try and convince them to see the error of their ways. And, somewhat surprisingly, it worked. I was very glad to see you could advocate for humanity to choose their own fate. And while I was frankly shocked that both of your adversaries ultimately agreed with this solution, I'm glad Bethesda gave you the option to wrap things up this way. The final ending, before either embarking on your first New Game Plus run or choosing to return to your current world, was also extremely well done. Beautiful, emotional, and ultimately satisfying no matter what you choose. I'm quite the sucker for emotional endings, and after spending over 60 hours getting to know and love my crew, I found myself unable to leave them all behind and embark upon an adventure in a brand new universe. I wasn't done making memories in my current lifetime, and I once again found myself thankful that Bethesda lets you choose when, or even if, you want to leave your first life behind and become Starborn. If I have one bone to pick with Starfield's main story, it's how the game chose to handle your decision in its high price to pay mission, where one of your beloved companions will end up dead. Based on my understanding, who lives and dies comes down to your two companions with which you share the highest affinity, and based on your choice to either stay behind at the lodge or race to the Eye, one of them will not survive. Because I romanced Sarah and she was caught on board the Eye, her life was cut short, much to my shock and dismay when I reached Constellation Space Station and realized what had happened. I honestly couldn't believe Bethesda had the guts to pull a stunt like that, but credit to them for not pulling any punches. While the sight of my love interest dead on the floor was heart-wrenching, what really struck me was a lack of acknowledgement from the rest of Constellation regarding the impact this would have had on my character in game. Yes, Sarah wanted to keep our relationship low-key so it wouldn't distract from our ultimate goal of uncovering more artifacts, but we were planning a wedding for goodness sake. Someone must have known something was going down, and the fact that none of the other characters reacted to my love interest dying at all was extremely disappointing, and I can't help but feel like the emotional impact of this moment was lessened by their apathy. All in all, it was an emotionally poignant moment, and I can't help but respect the move from Bethesda. Now that I've shouted Starfield's praises from the rooftops for however many minutes, we unfortunately need to discuss the other side of the coin. Aspects of Bethesda's latest RPG that were found lacking. The game's first pitfall, which will come as no surprise to anyone familiar with the company's previous body of work, are the bugs. And boy are they back in force. The bugs I encountered during my time with the game ranged from lighthearted and funny to downright infuriating and immersion shattering, and really made me wonder if all future Elder Scrolls, Fallout, and Starfield titles are doomed to repeat this cycle, no matter how many improvements are stuffed into Creation Engine 2. Fortunately, the vast majority that I encountered were mostly minor affairs. Characters clipping through surfaces, visual glitches, NPCs getting stuck in place while repeating voice lines over and over. The typical fare you'd expect from a Bethesda title. The next level were less funny. Companions venturing out into the harsh vacuum of space in their casual streetwear, talking over each other and ruining portions of dialogue, subtitles and voice lines not matching, and being unable to fully zoom and scroll around planetary maps. More annoying, but not completely game-breaking or immersion-shattering, yet. The final category, and the most egregious, did just that. Caused me to roll my eyes, sigh in frustration, and play around with save scumming to get my game working again. The worst offender in this category also happened to occur at one of the most inopportune moments possible, the culmination of my companion loyalty quest with Sarah Morgan. Without spoiling too much for those who haven't done it yet, this quest sees you return to the site of previous trauma in her life, where you discover a new character with huge implications for Sarah's future. The mission is emotional, impactful, and sees you helping her make one of the toughest choices in a long line of hard decisions she's had to face. And, unfortunately, it completely bugged out and ruined my immersion right before its conclusion. After defeating some enemies and being prompted to meet up with Sarah again, I followed my quest marker until I realized it was leading me all the way back to my ship, not where I had left Sarah earlier. I approached her as she walked towards me, but I couldn't interact with her. I tried reloading and returning to this location on my own, which also bugged the quest out and completely locked me in place while playing chopped up conversations in the background. I reloaded again, and this time, I followed my quest marker to a seemingly random boulder, which Sarah had miraculously spawned inside. Simply amazing. After revisiting old save files about a dozen times, I returned to the quest location, found a chair, and waited a couple hours in-game. Lo and behold, Sarah had returned and I could finally get on with the quest. But by then, any immersion I'd been enjoying up to that point was completely ruined, totally negating the story's emotional impact. Yes, it was a good quest, but it would have been a whole hell of a lot better if it hadn't completely broken about 90% of the way through. Beyond bugs, there are a few other areas where the game is simply lacking. Something many people called out after Starfield's release was the glacial pace of its opening hours, and I am more than inclined to agree with that assessment. What makes this problem even worse is the avalanche of complex systems the game throws at you, often with little to no explanation, forcing you to stop whatever you're doing and spend time figuring out how each of these mechanics actually work. Another fun-sucking pitfall you'll have to contend with is an absolutely awful inventory management system. Listen, I get it. I've been playing Bethesda games for over a decade, and as a compulsive hoarder, I've spent my fair share of time over-encumbered in both the Elder Scrolls and Fallout. But holy shit, I have never dealt with anything quite so bad as it is here in Starfield. There are so many different inventories to keep track of, across your companions, ships, bases, and more. And all of their weight limits combined are somehow never enough to store all of the crap you want to save for later. The first skill I maxed out was weightlifting, for the sole purpose of giving me a little more wiggle room when it came to picking shit up. I always prioritized gear that would increase my carrying capacity for the exact same reason. The mechanic was so annoying that I'd do anything to alleviate some of its constant pressure. I get it. You can't pick up everything, and you need to prioritize what's really important, but man, constantly fighting that pop-up in the right-hand corner telling you you're carrying too much was straight up not fun, and felt worse than any other Bethesda game by far. Another baffling decision was the lack of any handcrafted maps for major cities. I get not having surface maps for procedurally generated planets, but not including them for cities? Something we've had for decades now? Yes, you will eventually develop a mental map of each location. And yes, your scanner can highlight the path towards your current objective, but the number of times I get turned around, or just waste 5 minutes going the wrong way before I remembered where something was, soured my mood quite often. These really need to be added somewhere down the line. The last downfall I'll call out is performance, specifically when played on an NVIDIA graphics card. For those unaware, Starfield launched with upscaling support for AMD graphics in the form of FSR, but lacked the same DLSS counterpart for machines using NVIDIA hardware. Modders patched the missing feature in mere days after launch, and Bethesda has confirmed they'll be adding official DLSS support in a future update, But for now, playing the game on an Nvidia graphics card is a significantly worse experience without being able to leverage that tech, and that's just annoying, plain and simple. Running on an i9-10900 and Nvidia 3080, my PC struggled to hold a solid 60 FPS, even with the settings turned down quite a bit. I rarely saw any frame drops during space or ground combat, something I'm thankful for, but the game would find itself crawling at the strangest times. Pop-in was also extremely noticeable, especially when exploring wide open spaces, which is unfortunate because 90% of the time you spend exploring in Starfield will be done in mostly barren environments. It was quite distracting and off-putting, and happened more than enough for me to take note of it. Thankfully, I only experienced one hard crash during my entire playthrough, and to give credit where it's due, this was very nice to see, as someone who's been burned by corrupted save files and ruined quest lines too many times in previous BGS titles. Despite those issues, what really had me questioning whether or not I'd finish Starfield at all weren't the parts of the game that were broken or bad, but the ones that simply weren't designed for players like me, with one huge component of previous Bethesda RPGs that's been totally changed and didn't gel with me the same way it has for many others. To get a few minor ones out of the way, let's briefly touch on Persuasion, the scanner, and outpost building. Persuasion in Starfield is fine. It's a different system than we've had in other games, and while a change of pace is often nice, it seemed a bit too easy most of the time. Oh, someone you just met has something you need? Just say a few generic lines of dialogue and boom, you get what you wanted, no questions asked. It needed a little more depth to really grab me. The scanner is also fine, but the near constant need to have its overlay on your screen was jarring, and often took away from the beauty of the worlds you'd be exploring. It was somewhat useful for finding your way to objectives, but wasn't something I found very interesting or engaging. When it comes to outpost building, it's just not for me. I tinkered with the mechanic back in Fallout 4 and enjoyed it for what it was. A small mini-game that was entirely optional to your enjoyment of the overall experience. And it's the exact same here. Again, credit where it's due, Bethesda has done an excellent job of expanding on previous iterations of the system, and I've seen some truly incredible clips of entire factories and cities operating at jaw-dropping scale, but I'd much rather spend my time out exploring the stars instead of building on them. Finally, we come to the crux of my consternation with Starfield, something that nearly ruined my first 30 hours and almost sapped my will to play entirely, which can be summed up in two simple words: procedural generation. If you're a traditional Bethesda fan like I am, part of the magic in their titles is the ability to boot up the game and set out in any given direction looking for adventure, which you will find in no short supply, constantly uncovering beautiful locations filled with memorable encounters, unexpected quests, and challenging enemies. Starfield's planets are often just as beautiful as Oblivion's Cyrodiil or Fallout 4's rendition of New England, but compared to those handcrafted worlds, these spaces are mind-numbingly lifeless. Planets you can wander around for hours and not run into a single interesting character or location. There were certainly encounters that surprised me, and finding a rare landmark here or geological feature there helped to spice things up, but overall, the sacrifice and memorability for scale was apparent at almost every turn. Less than 20 hours into my playthrough, I began encountering repeated locations and events on different planets I would visit. The same research lab or mining outpost here, the same survivalist or bounty hunter in need of help there. And, while there is certainly an element of repetition to a mechanic like Radiant Quests in Skyrim, the experience of running into these things over and over again on entirely different planets was extremely bizarre. Seeing the same terminals, the same data pads, the same stories replayed over and over and over again was a major buzzkill, and became unbelievably boring very early on. Something that exacerbated this even further was the lack of any traversal method other than walking or boost pack skipping across these worlds. There are improved packs you can acquire and skills to improve your speed and stamina, but the game desperately needs another, quicker form of movement while exploring these locations, even if it's some sort of horse reskinned as a moon scooter or something similar shoehorned in down the line. I could not imagine forcing myself to repeat this loop across multiple zones on the same planet, and once I realized what the game's survey missions would entail, I immediately abandoned them and never looked back. Way back at the start of the video, I mentioned how one simple change in how I was approaching the game immediately turned the experience from lifeless and boring into the deeply engaging RPG that I gushed about earlier. And that change was this: I stopped exploring anything beyond the locations I was specifically sent to for quests or missions. Anything that wasn't directly related to a trackable entry in my journal might as well have not existed, and my enjoyment skyrocketed after I started taking that approach. After switching my mindset from playing Starfield as a traditional Bethesda RPG with open-world exploration to a quest-based RPG, where the ability to wander outside of story-related areas might as well not exist, the game completely changed. And that's precisely what stopped me from hanging up my spacesuit for good and turned me into such a huge advocate for Starfield, even in a year packed with must-play games. Starfield would be a better game for me if Bethesda had focused less on procedural generation and more on the bespoke content they are known for, and that I absolutely adore in their other games. If Starfield had 10 or 15 areas as dense and enjoyable to explore as Aquila or Jemison, and half the number of procedurally generated worlds, it would be a much better product. For me. And while playing the game as something other than a Bethesda RPG led me to falling in love with it, leaving behind a swath of unexplored map markers on every planet I touched down on still filled me with a sense of regret each time I lifted off, never to return. One of the most important things to realize as a consumer of any product, be it food, games, movies, or anything else really, is that sometimes you'll encounter something that isn't bad, it just wasn't made for you. My favorite analogy for these situations is comparing vintage and modern sports cars. If I ever went out with a fat stack of cash to pick out a high-speed motor vehicle of my choosing, 10 times out of 10 I'd choose the brand new model, complete with all the modern bells and whistles. I'd never buy a vintage muscle car, because they aren't my thing. But that's the beauty of cars, and the beauty of video games as well. Just because something isn't for me, doesn't mean it's bad. I might never buy an old sports car, but I can still appreciate them for what they are, and recognize that there are plenty of car lovers out there who'd happily forgo the latest Mustang, GTR, or R8 for an old school Corvette or an SX instead. I can admire their unique beauty and design, their vintage interiors and inner workings, and if someone offered me a ride in one, you can bet your ass I'd take them up on that offer in a heartbeat. And that's exactly how I've come to feel about Starfield. Starfield isn't your traditional Bethesda RPG, at least not fully. Plenty of the things Bethesda is known for are back and better than ever, companions, quests, and world building to name a few. But this is the company's first new IP in over 25 years. What better time to take some chances and mix things up with mechanics like spaceflight, planetary cataloging, and procedural generation. I'm a huge advocate for game developers trying new things, and Starfield is no exception. BGS certainly tried something new, and, judging by the fact that over 10 million players dipped their toes into the franchise within a week of release, I'd say that experimentation has certainly paid off, giving both Bethesda and Microsoft a much-needed win. Starfield is a game that wasn't made for me, and that's okay. I'm thankful to have found my own love for it all the same, and whether you're a diehard Bethesda OG like me, a fan of space adventures like No Man's Sky, or fall somewhere in between, I can wholeheartedly recommend picking up Bethesda's latest RPG, because there's something out in the Starfield that will grab you and pull you in, even if it's not the same thing that did so for me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more gaming content, and let me know your thoughts on Starfield in the comments below. You're a real one and I appreciate you. Catch you later, homies.